Two things before I start this video. First off, this is a devil's advocate perception of Jim Benning's trade deadline performance. This is not what I agree with, this is not what I believe, but this is a devil's advocate point of view, which means I will be siding with the opposite of what I believe, in order to provide better argument, analysis, and overall understanding of the situation at hand. Secondly, I'd like to give a shout out to BKLast12 on Twitter for this image that I used in the thumbnail of this video. Let's talk about Jim Benning's performance here at the trade deadline and why we didn't get any draft picks, and why this is okay. The first move of the day. Jim Benning trades Philip Holm over to the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for forward Brendan Leipsic. This deal? I'm seeing an overwhelming positive response online regarding this deal, which indicates to me that fans generally agree that this was a good, solid deal. And I particularly agree as well. I feel like Holm was a player who didn't get a chance with us, and we got him for free. He's not necessarily young, and we traded him for a guy who is young and who will be an annoying player to play against. Okay, that's pretty good. But the meat and potatoes of this trade deadline for Jim Benning was the Thomas Vanek trade over to the Columbus Blue Jackets, a 1-for-2 trade. Thomas Vanek in exchange for AHLer almost 23-year-old Tyler Mott, as well as aging $1.1 million man Jussi Jokinen. Why is this perceived as a bad trade? Well, it's perceived as a bad trade because we wanted draft picks. And Jim Benning, instead of getting something young that could really change our future, we got ourselves a player who is a borderline NHL, AHL player in Tyler Mott, who we don't know if he'll actually become something, because he's looking like he'll mostly project to being depth, as well as an older Jussi Jokinen, who is also up at the end of this year. So what the hell was that? Benning, he made a trade that was worse than just keeping Vanek. I've seen a lot of reactions online saying that they would rather keep Vanek than have gone through with this trade. And the biggest question here is, why did we not get any draft picks? Why did we not get any draft picks? Because this is a deal that, I don't know, fans, they were kind of anticipating this for a long time, right? Why didn't we get any draft picks? Well, Jim Benning, he came out here on the press conference and he said, along with Trevor Linden, nobody wanted to give up any draft picks. Nobody wanted to give up any draft picks in this year's draft for Thomas Vanek. And people responded to this in a way that was like, yeah, well, why did you not push for it then? Of course, people don't want to give up any draft picks. That's why you gotta force it out of them. You gotta keep on asking, and you gotta make your stand. That was a lot of the responses that I saw on Twitter. And I want to talk a little bit about why we didn't get any draft picks from a devil's advocate point of view. So, we didn't get any draft picks because nobody wanted to give them. And that's basically it. You can't ask for what's not there. Trevor Linden, he talked about how they've traded Kevin for picks. They've traded Eddie Lack for picks. If there were picks available in this opportunity, there would have been picks coming back to Vancouver, but it's just that nobody wanted to give them up. And the response to that was, what about Nash? What about Maroon? What about Letestu? What about all the other forwards that were traded at this trade deadline and the past few days that were able to get things like seconds and thirds and fourths? Ray Ferraro has your response. He came out on TSN radio. He said himself, I don't care how many points Vanek has. There's not enough trust to build a robust market around him, which I completely understand. Thomas Vanek is a guy who he already said he loved playing in Vancouver. He basically confirmed he's coming back next year through free agency. And he has a reputation of disappearing in the playoffs and not necessarily becoming the player that teams hoped him to be when playing in the postseason. Oh, well, why did Rick Nash grab a first? Vanek has more points than Rick Nash. Yeah, well, Rick Nash isn't one-dimensional like Thomas Vanek is. And I'm gonna call him that. I'm gonna call Thomas Vanek one-dimensional. Why? Because what's his biggest strength? It's getting points. It's offense. What else does he do besides that? I'll wait. Does he penalty kill? No. Does he back-check really hard? Not really. Is he a good defensive presence for the Vancouver Canucks? Not really. He is a one-dimensional player in the sense that he is purely offensive. Rick Nash, he's a big body, he can play the PK. Michael Grabner, he's really speedy, he can back-check. He can play the PK as well, he's a PK specialist. All these other guys that got traded at the deadline, who have less points than Thomas Vanek, who were able to get more for their teams through trade than Tyler Mott and Jussi Jokinen. These players were all more valuable to a team than a Thomas Vanek. Would you do it? Would you trade for a Thomas Vanek who already said, basically, yeah, I'm not going to resign with whatever team I get traded to, I'm coming back to Vancouver? Would you trade a pick for this guy who already confirmed he's not going to sign with your team, and who isn't a reliability in the playoffs? Would you trade for a guy who you know is not going to be on your team next year, and who people don't necessarily trust in a playoff role? This is why we didn't get any draft picks for him. Because every opportunity that we had to trade Thomas Vanek, nobody wanted to give him up. Because Ray Ferraro said it best, I don't care how many points Vanek has, there's not enough trust to build a market around his play. Which is why nobody offered a draft pick for him. Jim Benning and Trevor Linden, they said themselves, we took the best offer available for Thomas Vanek, and that includes a roster player coming back in Jussi Jokinen, which, to be fair, he's not really that good, and Tyler Mott, who he might be able to become like a Granlund-type player or something, but don't bet on it. And overall, a lot of people were saying this is the worst. It would be better if we kept Vanek. Would it really be now? Vanek's going to come back next season through free agency, no question. Let's ignore Jussi Jokinen because he's basically just an add-on to this deal, another roster player in the mix. Would we rather keep Vanek, re-sign him, and play him throughout next season, or would we have traded Vanek for a Tyler Mott and then taken Vanek back so that we can have Vanek and Tyler Mott next season? It is literally, by definition, a win for the Vancouver Canucks in the fact that we were able to get more for a player that we would have had next year. Of course, people were saying, yeah, well, it's just disappointing that we didn't get a pick. Yeah, it is disappointing we didn't get a pick. But that's the market. They didn't want to give up a pick for him. Nobody wanted to give up a pick for him. Because he's a player who did not pledge loyalty to any team other than Vancouver for next season, and his playoff track record isn't the most reliable. Well, why didn't Jim Benning trade any of the other guys? Del Zotto, Biega, Gagne, Sutter, any one of these guys to get draft picks? And in relation to that, roster spots. The Utica Comets. Those are my two answers for that. First off, what players would we be able to get back in an NHL role if we traded those players, and what players would have to satisfy this deal in order for us to get a pick back? Our players are trash. If we traded our players for other roster players, there is no way we'd be able to squeak a pick out of that. You won't see us trading Brandon Sutter for another center and being able to get a pick back, because no team would see that as value. Same thing with a Sam Gagne. Same thing with a Louis Eriksson. You could say, what about Goodbranson and Tanev? Well, if you want to do that, there's time at the draft. And that, I believe, is one of the bigger key components of this trade deadline here, as to why we didn't get picks. We need to play out the rest of the season. And in order to do that, we need our guys. We can't just keep on calling guys up from Utica. The deadline down there in the AHL is close. And that means that if guys are staying up with the Vancouver Canucks roster past that deadline, they can't help the Comets in the playoffs. Darren Archibald is most likely going to be in that category in not being able to play in the AHL playoffs. So he most likely will be staying with the big club. But if you take a look at the players we had, What kind of team would have been willing to trade for, I don't know, let's say a defenseman, Eric Goodbranson, and for centers we'll say a Sam Gagner? What kind of team would trade for one of these players and give a roster player back in the same positional need and still feel the need to give up a draft pick? Unless we're trading for a player who is definitely significantly worse, that is not going to happen. And nobody would have been willing to make that deal. With guys like McDonough and Letestu and Rick Nash and Evander Kane on the market, nobody even considered wanting to get guys like Brandon Sutter or Gagner. If you want to talk about Tanev, well, we have the draft to talk about that. And I think that's where we gotta go. Next up is the draft. We couldn't have traded that many roster players here today because, well, we need to play out the rest of the season. Thomas Vanek fetched us 2 players who people are arguing are garbage. So, what would a Sam Gagner, who's worse, have fetched us? Do you think we would have been able to get a roster player back as well as a draft pick? What about Sven Berchi? JT Brown was a guy who's younger than Berchi and has more points. He was traded alongside McDonough to Tampa Bay in that big deal. In return, there was Nemestikov, who's the same age as Berchi. There isn't a market for Vancouver players. New York was able to get picks and prospects coming back because they have assets, and we don't. That is why the Vancouver Canucks didn't get any draft picks this season. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Plus, news, gaming, and bye.